What really happened behind one of Hayden Panettiere's most painful and complicated relationships? For years, her romance with Brian Hickerson made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But the full story is far more complicated than the headlines ever suggested. Hayden Panettiere was already a household name when her relationship with Hickerson began. She had built a successful career through Heroes, Nashville, and major film roles, becoming one of Hollywood's most recognizable young stars. But behind the red carpets and television success, her personal life was becoming increasingly difficult to separate from the public spotlight. Their relationship quickly attracted attention. Then came allegations, legal trouble, public statements, and moments that left fans deeply concerned about Hayden's well-being. But that's not the whole story. What happened next surprised everyone. The relationship went through multiple chapters, including separation, reconciliation, and renewed public scrutiny. Hayden eventually spoke about parts of her experience herself, offering a perspective that helped explain just how complicated the situation had become. And there is an important distinction here. This isn't simply a story about a celebrity romance gone wrong. It's a story about a woman navigating an intensely public personal struggle while trying to rebuild her life, protect her family, and find her way forward. So, how did Hayden and Brian's relationship begin? What happened behind the headlines? And how did Hayden ultimately move beyond one of the darkest chapters of her life? Let's go back to the beginning. When Hayden Panettiere and Brian Hickerson first became a couple in 2018, the relationship initially looked like a new beginning for the actress. Hayden had recently ended her long-term relationship with Ukrainian boxer Vladimir Klitschko, with whom she shares her daughter, Kaya. Soon after, she was photographed with Hickerson, and the two appeared to be moving quickly. At first, there were plenty of ordinary signs of a new romance. They were seen holding hands, spending time together, and attending events. Hayden even introduced Hickerson to her family during a trip to Florida. At the time, reports described them as having met through a mutual friend and hitting it off quickly. But the relationship would soon take a much darker turn. In May 2019, Hickerson was arrested following a domestic violence incident, and a judge later issued a protective order requiring him to stay away from Hayden. News reported at the time that Hayden was trying to create distance and focus on rebuilding her life and career. Then, in February 2020, Hickerson was arrested again in Wyoming on an alleged domestic battery charge. According to court documents reported by News, authorities said Hayden told them Hickerson had physically attacked her during an argument. Those allegations became impossible to separate from the story of their relationship. And yet, even after the breakup, the connection between Hayden and Brian wasn't completely over. What happened in the years that followed would make their story even more complicated. And that's where the next chapter begins. What happened after Brian Hickerson's 2021 jail sentence made Hayden Panettiere's story even more complicated. Rather than simply disappearing from each other's lives, Hayden and Brian were seen together again after his release. At the time, Hickerson said they were not back together and described their relationship as a friendship while he worked on his recovery. For Hayden, forgiveness appeared to become an important part of moving forward. In 2022, she told people that their relationship had been a very dark and complicated period in her life, while also saying she believed in people getting help and making amends. But that's where the story becomes especially difficult. That same year, Hayden and Brian were involved in a physical altercation outside a Los Angeles bar. Hayden later acknowledged that the incident was not her best behavior and made clear that the situation was complicated. Fans immediately began asking questions. Why were they still spending time together after everything that had happened? Was their relationship truly over, or was there still an emotional connection between them? The answer wasn't simple. The pair reportedly broke up in 2022, but they continued to cross paths. They were seen together at the funeral of Hayden's brother Jansen in 2023, and they were photographed together again at Los Angeles International Airport in March 2026. And then came the revelation that changed how people looked at their entire history. Hayden discussed their relationship in her 2026 memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, giving readers a deeper look at the struggles she had faced and the complicated process of trying to heal. But the story wasn't finished yet. In fact, the final chapter would bring Brian back into the headlines in a way nobody expected. The final chapter of Hayden Panettiere and Brian Hickerson's story is especially difficult to understand without looking at the months before Hayden's death. In May 2026, Hickerson spoke with TMZ about Hayden and her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning. Despite their complicated history, he spoke warmly about her, calling her an exceptionally kind person and saying she would always have a special place in his heart. He also acknowledged that the two probably weren't good together and said he believed she needed the freedom to flourish in her career. But that's not the whole story. Hayden's memoir gave her own perspective on the painful relationship and the abuse she said she experienced. The book was released only months before her death and became an important part of her effort to speak openly about addiction, trauma, recovery, and the difficult chapters of her life. Then, in August 2026, Hayden died at just 36. Her cause and manner of death have not been publicly determined, and reports of a possible overdose remain unconfirmed while the investigation continues. What happened next brought renewed attention to Hickerson. Reports revealed that he had been with Hayden shortly before her death, while authorities continued investigating the circumstances. Hickerson's previous domestic violence case also returned to the headlines, with reports that his request to reduce felony charges had been denied shortly before Hayden's death. Fans immediately began asking questions, but it's important not to turn unanswered questions into accusations. The real story is about a complicated relationship, a woman who publicly described her struggle to rebuild her life, and a tragic ending that has left many details still unresolved. And as Hayden's loved ones begin remembering her legacy, the focus is now shifting toward the person she was beyond the headlines. By the summer of 2026, Hayden Panettiere's relationship with Brian Hickerson had entered another complicated chapter. The two had been apart, but recent reporting indicates they reconnected shortly before Hayden's death. According to reports, they spent time together in Los Angeles before traveling to South Carolina, where Hayden would ultimately die. Some friends reportedly did not know the two had reconnected, adding another layer of surprise to the story. But it's important to be extremely careful here. Their reunion does not, by itself, explain what happened to Hayden, and authorities have not publicly established that Hickerson caused or contributed to her death. Police have said the investigation remains ongoing, and her official cause and manner of death are still pending toxicology results. What happened next would make the situation even more difficult for fans to process. On August 16th, Hayden was found unresponsive at a South Carolina apartment. A police report says Brian Hickerson and his brother Zach were the residents when officers arrived. Emergency responders were already performing CPR, and Hayden was eventually pronounced dead at 2:31 p.m. The report also says there were no obvious physical reasons for Hayden to be unresponsive. Investigators later conducted a search of the residence, while the medical examiner continued working to determine the cause of death. An autopsy found no signs of trauma contributing to her death, and this is where the story becomes especially heartbreaking. Hayden had spent years trying to rebuild her life after publicly discussing addiction, trauma, and a difficult relationship with Hickerson. Her recent memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, was part of that effort to tell her own story in her own words. Now, the same relationship has become part of the questions surrounding her final days. But unanswered questions are not answers. As investigators continue examining what happened, Hayden's story deserves to be remembered for far more than her relationship with Brian Hickerson. And that brings us to the part of her life that many fans may have overlooked, the woman Hayden was becoming when she was trying to leave those painful chapters behind. As investigators continue working to establish exactly what happened in Hayden Panettiere's final hours, the most important thing to remember is that many questions remain unanswered. Her autopsy reportedly found no trauma that contributed to her death, but the official cause and manner of death are still pending toxicology results. Authorities have also said there is no indication of foul play at this stage. That uncertainty has made the situation even more painful for fans. Hayden has spent the final period of her life trying to tell her own story. Her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, released in May 2026, explored her childhood in Hollywood, addiction, postpartum depression, motherhood, trauma, and the physically abusive relationship she described in her own words. The book was supposed to be part of a new chapter,